This is the Almost Awakened Podcast, a no-nonsense approach to spirituality with your hosts, Brittany Hartley and Bill Reel. Here we dive deep into the wisdom traditions while acknowledging insightful breakthroughs in science, psychology, and human development. Our goal is to explore the good life and the very best of spirituality. No nonsense required. Check us out at almostawakened.org, where you can check out past episodes, make a donation, email us a question or comment, or find out more about the resources we shared. And now, today's podcast episode.
Britt Hartley, how are you?
I'm so good, Bill. How are you?
I'm excellent. Life is good. Life treating you well?
Yeah, I have a question for you before you start. You
Please.
spend time on social media from time to time.
A little bit, just a little
and
bit.
You'll engage with people from time to time. And I'm trying to, I've been more active on social media lately, now that my kids are in school, putting out content and just things that I'm interested in. And I get quite a bit of pushback. And I have that tendency, and I think you do too, that I enjoy dialogue, I enjoy debate, I enjoy conversation, and I want to talk with each person or respond to each thing. Or I get mad and I'll think about how I would make an argument to this person, and I'll think about it for the rest of the day. And then I go through a few days not looking at the comments so that I can get my mental health back in order. And then I kind of swing back and forth. And so my question is kind of, how have you made peace with social media in wanting to put out messages that you would have found helpful to yourself at earlier stages of your deconstruction, but not have it take over your life and your mental well-being? How do you do that?
I don't know if I've done that. So let me say that
you've been on social media longer than me. So do you have any words of wisdom for me?
So the one thought is, in the last, say, 6 months or so, there's times where, like just this morning, I saw something on thoughtful faith. It's like the new Facebook group that Jacob Hansen's in charge of, right? And so I'm a member of that Facebook group, and I see a post come across my feed this morning, and it was incendiary. And I wanted to respond. And I thought for about 10 seconds that I could waste an hour responding to that, or I could just not respond to it. And I chose not to. And I think the older I get, I sort of pick and choose. If I can poke in, say something in a few minutes, maybe get somebody or a few people to kind of think through something, great. If I'm just going to get caught up in some back and forth with somebody, I tend to no longer get into those. You won't see big, long threads with me responding back and forth over and over and over again. I'll tell you, I think a better thing to do would be to create an artistic drawing and make your message that way.
Yeah, well, I'll definitely ask the same question to the guest that we have today. But yeah, I think the thing with TikTok is when someone stitches your videos, they can do a 3 or 4 minute multiple kind of attack on both what you're saying and also your character, right? And so I'm sitting there watching some of these videos, like, for lack of a better word, Jesus Christ, and then, sometimes I have to resettle before I decide how I want to respond to it. But man, it's a tough world out there.
2 other little things. One is that bad publicity is still good publicity, number 1.
I guess it doesn't feel like that.
And number 2, there's an old cliche in the World Wrestling Federation vernacular, which was red equals green. And so anytime there's blood, it actually meant more money, more ratings. And so having a little bit of you said this and you said that, and I think is all good for ratings. So I wouldn't be so quick to need all that to go away.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Getting some green lights from Bill to respond to these attacks on my character. Yeah. My gosh. But I'm super excited for today. We've been looking forward to this for a few weeks. We are going to bring on David Hayward, ex-pastor, cartoonist that goes by the name of the Naked Pastor. If you've ever even dipped your toe into the deconstruction space, you've seen his cartoons and you probably don't even know it. And we are so excited to hear more about the man behind the cartoons today. So we'll bring on David Hayward, aka the Naked Pastor. How are you, David?
I'm great. How are you guys?
Awesome. So super glad. Like she said, we've been fans from afar for so long. As you've shared your artwork with a message,
Well,
it is obvious that you have been on the path that we have been on, probably years and years ahead of us. And there were moments where your work gave me a chance to just recenter, take a breath, and go, let's not take this all too seriously.
And
that's
for
great.
me, yeah, and for me, Bill and I are both kind of more wordsy, maybe a little leaning on the verbose side at times. And when we want to tackle an idea, I mean, we can go 3 hours without even blinking an eye if we really get going. And the beauty of kind of what you do and why I have such holy envy for it is that you can say in a sentence, in one sentence in a cartoon, what Bill and I take 3 hours to lay out.
And what we've experienced for a decade.
Yes, and it will pierce someone, just as strong, if not stronger, in the brevity that you're able to do it with. Whereas, Bill and I have to kind of dance around it a lot longer to get there. And I just really appreciate your gift with that.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me on your show too. And hello, everybody out there. But, I've also written 10 books and I'm writing my 11th. So I do have words as well.
Yes, you do. We're gonna get into all that. I want to know all the
Yeah.
things. So my first question is just for those who have maybe just seen a cartoon and just have no idea about who you are. Can you just tell us a little bit about your story, especially your religious background and how you became the Naked Pastor?
Okay. Yeah, I was raised in a Christian home. My mom and dad were born again at a Billy Graham crusade, so I was born Anglican. I was baptized as an Anglican as a baby. And then we just sort of shifted around to different churches, whatever was convenient. My dad was transferred around a lot. And so we just found the most convenient church. So we weren't loyal to any one denomination until I was about 15 or so. And I got born again at a Baptist youth group. And then we switched to Pentecostal. I ended up going to a Pentecostal Bible college in the States. I'm from Canada, by the way, in the States. And that's where I met my wife, Lisa, who is an American. Then I went for my master's at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in New Testament Studies. Long story short, I was taking my PhD in New Testament when we got side railed by becoming pregnant and couldn't afford continuing in that, in school. So I ended up getting ordained as a Presbyterian minister and pastored in the Presbyterian Church in Canada for many years. And then I quit one day and ended up a vineyard pastor. And if many of you don't know what that is, vineyard is sort of a mix between Baptist kind of theology and evangelical theology and Pentecostal experience or charismatic experience and so on. And then I left the ministry in 2010 to devote full time to Naked Pastor, which I'd been running for 5 years already. I launched Naked Pastor in 2005, started cartooning in 2006. And yeah, it's gone from there. The reason I called my blog Naked Pastor was because at the time, Naked Chef, Naked Archaeologist, Naked Truth, all those were popular at the time. And so, it's nothing to do with nudity, but it has to do with being raw and real and vulnerable and honest and, without adornment. And so I wanted to sort of pull back the curtain and let people see what really goes on in the ministry, what really goes on in the church and in Christianity as an honest sort of critique with love of what I was experiencing as a pastor. So, yeah, that's how Naked Pastor came about.
I want to follow up and ask, did you feel really safe inside to be vocal about the things that were going on around you? Or was there a sort of like a leaning into it and kind of going like, oh, like I can be vulnerable and that's actually appreciated? Because it seems like in this religious arena, we often come to being straightforward and vulnerable really carefully.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I'm a little bit naive. I assume people will be excited about the same things I'm excited about, and that I don't mean to be vulnerable. I do mean to be honest, but I have this sort of naive assumption that other people are going to appreciate that. And sometimes I'm surprised, well, often I'm surprised that people don't appreciate that honesty or whatever as much as I do. There are times though when I do press post when I'm sure I'm going to get some kickback, but most of the time I'm just like la 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 la, having fun, drawing pictures, posting them on the internet, and seeing what happens.
I'm curious about, so in that story, there was like quitting and going to a new ministry. And then there was also like you were still a minister, but you started blogging, and the blog was kind of dealing with some of maybe the heavier things that were weighing on you that you've
Right.
seen in your ministry. So can you talk a little bit more of just like that period, and you're inside the walls, deconstructing, making sense of it, and just kind of how that looked from the side of experience?
Well, I actually started my deconstruction journey actually started on the day of my graduation from seminary. It was the actual day of my graduation. I was in my gown. I was getting ready to go to the ceremony, and I was freaking out because I suddenly realized I wasn't sure about the inspiration of Scripture anymore. Now, the inspiration of Scripture to me was the cornerstone of all my belief system. It was the bedrock. All my beliefs sort of stemmed from that. And so what that did, it was kind of like a massive continental shift in my spirit or whatever, in my mind, that if the Bible isn't inspired, then everything I believe is at risk. And so it was that was a very traumatic moment for me. My wife actually had to grab me by the shoulders and say, "You got to go to your graduation ceremony." And it was devastating, but that's where it began. I still went into, continued my studies, continued in the ministry, hoping one day that this would all figure out and make sense. And so that's the path I chose, was giving myself time to integrate that trauma and that change of mind and theology with, what I believed and what I didn't believe. And hopefully over time it would make sense, until it was around 2009 when all the pieces seemed to fall in place. That's a long time. Like, it's like 30 years. And it was the next year I actually left the ministry. Yeah.
Maybe back a little bit to the question I asked previously.
Mhm.
You have to imagine that when you're criticizing the unhealthiness of religion, which often your work is doing, and very, very poignantly,
Mhm.
what is some of the, yeah, you're welcome. What is some of the pushback? Have you gotten any, Orthodox believers in various religious systems writing you and criticizing you for kind of poking at the church? And
Oh yeah.
I'm just curious what some of that's looked like.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like, I get a lot of people saying, "You've left the church, leave us alone,"
Yeah.
kind of an
Yeah,
attitude.
we've heard that. We've heard that a few times.
But when I was in the church, it was also like, "You're a part of this church, leave us alone." Like, so it was like, don't bite the hand that feeds you. But now, now you have no right to say anything because you're not a part of it. So those are all attempts to silence the critique, and to, keep everything cozy and comfortable in the way it always has been. But yeah, I get critique all the time that the church is the bride of Christ, and it's beautiful, and it's not the church, it's the bad churches or the bad ministers or pastors or whatever. And I have a lot of people saying, like, why are you still harping on this? Like, why can't you just drop it and leave it alone? It's because I care. Like, religion's here to stay. So is Christianity, included in religion, of course. And I believe the church is here to stay. I think people should have the right to gather as communities around shared values. I support that. I believe in that. And in many ways, it helped me and nourished me. I call the church my family of origin, kind of like my mother. I had to move out, though, because she was way too controlling. But that's the way I sort of view it. And so in many ways I care. If we're going to do this, can we please do it in a healthy manner? That's basically my approach to critiquing the church and its theology and the way it gathers.
Yeah, we couldn't agree more. Before we move on to kind of your life post active pastor, what did you love most when you look back? Is there anything that you miss, or just what did you love the most about being a pastor?
Well, this is the catch-22, and it's the community. Like, I think the biggest pain point of most people who leave the church is that they miss the community aspect of it. And I had a huge sort of learning curve lesson after I left the ministry. I decided to watch some documentaries on cults, and it was very interesting to me that to a T, almost everybody who left the cult were in tears, even though they were horribly abused and they knew it. They still missed the intensity of intimacy and the community that they had. And it started me thinking, maybe those come together, that intense intimacy, no secrets, sharing everything, all your activities are around that community or in that community. It's sort of a ghetto bubble of religious intensity and fellowship and so on. Maybe that's not as healthy as I thought it was, so I've had to go back in hindsight and sort of critique what is true community, what is healthy community, and that community that we miss. Do we really want that again? Because I think sometimes it's kind of like a Trojan horse that allows in some kinds of abuses that I don't think any of us want to return to. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I 100% know what you mean. And Bill and I have talked about this a lot, that are on the outside now, our relationships are a lot deeper because we don't have to pretend or kind of show this face that you have to do at church. And so we've had to re-examine, did this, this room that we feel like we were loved and we belonged, how much of that was really real, and how much of that can I get kind of even more intimate on the outside. And so I resonate with that a lot, but there are still times, even though Bill and I can speak until the cows come home about the abuses of Mormonism or the falsehoods of Mormonism, or kind of the illusion of belonging. We can talk about that all day long. But for me personally, and that this may surprise some people, there are still some times, because I have so many family and friends around me who are still active members, that if the church were to say, if you could be a secular Mormon, like you can be a secular Jew, where you can just kind of show up sometimes and be totally accepted, that I would still come back from time to time, because there are some people that I miss, that I've lost. And so it's like holding both. Like there are times where I feel like I would want to go back if I wasn't so shunned as I am now, to be able to, but also the belonging and intimacy that I have on the other side is a lot deeper than I used to have. So both of those are true.
Yeah.
And I hold both of those. Yeah.
Are you both Exmos then?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, see.
Yeah. So we don't talk about Mormonism a lot on this podcast. Bill has a whole platform of other Mormon spectrum podcasters. But on this podcast, we focus mostly on, okay, we've deconstructed, we've left, what's next? And that's kind of what our podcast does. But that is our kind of first faith family, as you say.
That's kind of the bread and butter of the umbrella of podcasts that we do, is that we help give people information sufficient that they can make new choices, and in most instances, I think, eventually leave Mormonism.
Yeah, and that's huge. That's really huge. Yeah, that's fantastic, actually.
You got one, Bill? Okay, I'll go.
No, go ahead.
There's, in some senses, you love just the community and how you can just show up, and there's just kind of this instant community when you're a part of a church. And then what was when you look back, what was the most difficult thing about being an active pastor? Like what was always just kind of grinding at your soul or giving you cognitive dissonance, or what was just the hardest thing about it?
Well, it's I think for me, what bothered me the most, I always struggled with my calling as a pastor. And I struggled most with working within the system. I I believe there is such a thing as systemic evil, and I believe all systems are prone to it and have the germ. And I think it takes the members and the leadership of any community intense intentionality to prevent what I believe is a gravitational pull towards the dehumanization of its members. I really do believe that needs to be absolutely number one intentional in the minds of communities, is how to prevent it from becoming abusive and manipulative and coercive and all those things. I think that has to be the number one. And so I constantly was making that number one. But the system, if you don't have cooperation within that community, if people don't understand that dynamic of systemic evil, and the gravitational pull of all organizations, all systems towards dehumanization, then it's really an uphill battle. And so that's what I was constantly fighting against inside the system, was to prevent it from, crystallizing into something abusive.
Yeah.
And yeah, sorry, Bill.
No. I can relate deeply. I served as a bishop in the LDS Church. It's a lay ministry. I didn't go to any kind of training or anything for it. No training at all. And I was just a carpet salesman called to lead a congregation and have interviews with kids about sexual, when they would come in and have a something they're doing that they felt shame over, to sit and try to counsel. I was newly married myself, essentially, and trying to counsel folks on what they should do to solve their marital problems. But I think you hit the nail on the head. Like you, I think Britt would agree. We both loved community. It's sort of fake once you get on the outside and realize that you only belong so long as you fit the part and look like you're one of them.
Mhm,
But the negative was that when I became a bishop, the LDS Church hands all of its leaders a manual, a handbook, and it
mhm,
says, when somebody comes to you with an issue over homosexuality, or you have a youth who's confessing breaking the law of chastity, this is how you handle these things, right? And
right.
so you can come to the calling, you can come to the responsibility really healthy, having the ability to kind of let people be their version of humanity. But then you're told that what God really wants you to do is handle all of these things a certain way. And hence it's kind of a safe space for abusive behavior. So if somebody comes to uh,
Mhm,
in a leadership position, they can sit down with a child, for instance, in a one-on-one conversation, and the rest of the congregation sort of expects that to be normal. And
mhm.
meanwhile, you're just a grown man behind closed doors with a kid,
Yeah, yeah.
But it takes very healthy people, and it sort of sabotages their healthiness and says, I know you would prefer to do things this really healthy way, but in order to follow the rules of the church, you need to handle it this way. And
Mhm,
you're sort of sabotaged into thinking that unhealthiness is healthy. And so I
mhm.
can totally relate to
Yeah,
your thoughts there on both the pros and the cons.
yeah. One of my books that I wrote is called "Without a Vision, My People Prosper." It's uh, playing around with that verse. Without a vision, my people perish. But I sort of take uh, um, Bonhoeffer's idea of community, that visionary thinking uh, is kills community, and sort of embellish that. And I took a whole bunch of my blog posts where I talk about um, try to do church and community without a vision, without a goal, without a mission statement, and all those things. And we did that, and it really was wonderful. Like we were, you know, performing an experiment in community, and it was chaos, but it was creative chaos. And what I find is a lot of churches and leaders and so on are lean towards managing people and controlling people. And the thought of not having a vision and not having a common goal and all those kinds of things messes with their leadership conscience. and they can't do it, and the church ends up becoming that kind of controlling atmosphere. Excuse me.
Before we move on to kind of your books and your cartoons, I get this question a lot because when I had to be honest with myself about how I had kind of lost my faith in God. I was about to write my dissertation in my PhD in theology and realized I don't think I can write this thing because I don't think I believe in God anymore. And that was a very hard day. But for you, do you regret getting your degree in kind of religious studies and theology, or even now kind of being on the outside of organized religion, do you enjoy that process for what it taught you about human nature, or both?
So early
do you regret
on,
kind of getting your education? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So early on in my pastoral career, I took a clinical pastoral education course, and the instructor was excellent. And he introduced me to Carl Jung, and I dove deep into him and his writing, his ideas. And, the whole integration of all of our parts, including our shadow, all these things meant a lot to me and made sense to me. At the same time, I was reading Thomas Merton, sort of the mystics and all this kind of thing. And my approach to my life then became, all right, even though I don't agree with like the Pentecostal Bible College I went to, a lot of what they taught or believed, or, an evangelical seminary, Gordon Conwell, even though I don't agree with everything I was taught there, somehow I need to figure out a way to integrate all this stuff into my life, rather than saying I was duped, it was all bullshit, I'm moving on, and rejecting it all. For me, the healthier way is to figure out a way to integrate all that, like fold it all in. The analogy I like to use is like compost. It's half soil and half shit. Excuse my language, but it's true. And it all gets folded in together, the good and the bad, to make something even richer. And so that's how I sort of approach my past. Even all my experience as a pastor, all the good and the bad somehow gets folded in to make the culture out of which I am growing as me. So it's kind of like, I like to say, I wouldn't be who I am now unless I was who I was then. If you tore out those chapters in my life, I wouldn't make any sense now. So it all gets folded in, all gets integrated, and somehow I think that makes me wiser and deeper and more empathetic, and more compassionate and understanding of other people who are going through all kinds of things. So I have another analogy too, where I used to think of growth as linear, where you leave the past behind you. That no longer made sense to me. So then I sort of adopted the stages one, James Fowler, the stages of faith. But then that didn't make sense either, because you kind of look down on your previous stages as if you're elevating yourself. Now I think of growth as spatial, where you grow outward, and it includes everything that went before. There's no rejection. It's all assimilated somehow. Nothing's wasted. And that's how I think of growth now.
It's interesting when you talk, because as you're using words to express yourself, I can still tell that your mind is very visual in just the analogies that you use. It's very interesting to listen to. And your Canadian comes out every once in a while when you say a boot and other things.
Yeah, I know.
But yeah, you have I could just tell in your analogies that you have this kind of visual way of processing this. And Bill and I have talked about this on the podcast before, because we've used, stage Fowler, or the Fowler stages of faith before. And then you can get into conversations where people will say, I'm at stage 5 and you're just at stage 3. You're too binary. You're not where I am yet, and you can have an ego trip with that. And then both of us kind of started to get more into like spiral dynamics, and that it's just this kind of, you go deeper in, you connect deeper without. And it's almost like this more spiral kind of in and out movement, where you're still returning back to things that you learned previously, and it's not gone. And it's something that I encourage people to do when they're deconstructing, is because sometimes in the deconstruction world, we can just talk a lot about how religion is bullshit, or all the ways that it's bullshit, in a way that shames our previous self. And when we do that, it just doesn't feel like wholeness to me, like you're talking about. It feels like I'm shaming 20 years of my life and calling myself stupid and evil. And that's not how I felt like that's not what I felt like I was doing when I was that person. And so it feels a lot more whole to kind of look back at your story with some grace and see kind of where you are and why you were driven to do what you do, and your anxieties and human nature and institution and all these things. And that's why I always say that even as an atheist now, and I'm not doing anything that I thought I'd be doing with my theology degree, I just don't regret any of that education at all, or that story at all, for the same reason. So I really resonate with that.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit more about your books. And I will admit, I knew you had been doing cartoons for years, like years and years, for, I mean, I didn't deconstruct till maybe 2010. So you were already very active by then. And I didn't even know that there were books. And so I'm so excited to hear more.
I'm your typical artist. I suck at
so I'm so excited. Tell us about your books, kind of maybe the ones that you would stand out for maybe this audience. So this audience are those people who are still kind of curious about spirituality, but wanting to do it in a more healthy way after deconstruction is probably where most of our audience is. So tell us about your books and which ones kind of stand out to you as you look back of the 9 you have going on.
Yeah. So I have a few books are just collections of cartoons. But a few of the books that I'll tell you about that are my best sellers, let's say, and I'm not, every writer knows, well, most writers know, 99% of writers know they don't make a lot of money from books. But so the books that are most popular, I'd say one of my most popular is The Liberation of Sophia, and it's a series of drawings I did of a woman in the wilderness who made her escape from oppression, the patriarchy and religion and so on. And it's just her in the wilderness. And I did a meditation for each one. There's like 59 drawings in that. That's very popular, especially with women. Then I have another one called Questions Are the Answer. And it's basically kind of like a memoir of how I came to the conclusion that questions are actually the most valid vehicle for wisdom, and questions shouldn't be shunned or be feared, but embraced. And so that's what that whole book's about. I wrote a book for people who are deconstructing while married, and I call that one Till Doubt Do Us Part, When Changing Beliefs Change Your Marriage, because that happens to a lot of couples. One might start deconstructing while the others, digging in their heels, or vice versa, whatever. And so Lisa and I went through that. After I left the ministry, we sort of crashed. Our marriage was in rough shape there for a couple of years. So I wrote a lot about that and compiled that with a bunch of kind of funny cartoons in there as well to illustrate the different aspects of trying to stay married while changing our beliefs. And so that one is helping a lot of people. And then I wrote another one. This will be the last one I mentioned, but I did mention the one on visionary thinking in the church. And then one on, I did one on deconstruction called The Lasting Supper, and Letters for Deconstruction. And then the last one I'll mention is I did one on money, believe it or not, called Money is Spiritual. And because when I left the ministry, I realized I had a really unhealthy attitude about money, about business, about selling, about promoting my art, about marketing, all these things. And I had to go to the University of Life to heal myself of some really bad attitudes about all that. And so I basically exercised my demons by writing about it, and came out with that book, Money is Spiritual. And it's for people who, have a hard time with money, have a really negative attitude about money. And that might be, evangelical Christians or Christians in general, or religious people in general, or artists or creators or writers or whatever. So those are the books I'm going to mention.
Yeah, I'm curious, just before you go on, Bill, I'm curious about the money one, because that is a demon I've had to wrestle with, because in the faith tradition we come from, everybody gives their service for free. Like that's kind
Mhm.
of what we do, right? And
Mhm.
so as I'm moving into this space as a spiritual director, where I'm asking for money for, my education and my time and my spiritual services, like that was so hard at first. Like I
Mhm.
felt like, am I just like one of those gross gurus that's just asking for money for something that I should be giving away for free? And
Yeah.
I was a big mess with all of that. So that, of all the ones, I think I'm going to check out that one first. Okay, go ahead, Bill.
It's a tough one. I mean, when I wrote that book and I started sharing that I'd written a book on money, I couldn't believe the hatred I got back for that. And but like when we left the ministry, we had to file for bankruptcy um, because we were so bad off, so deep in debt and so poor, and no income. And I realized, you know what? If I'm going to make it in this world, if I'm going to help support myself, my wife, our kids, we have 3 grown kids now. But like if I'm going to be able to pay rent or mortgage and have a car and all that, I need to figure this out, because I can't keep going down this path. And so I went to school. Like I went to conferences, I got coaching, I read books, and there is a lot of iffy stuff out there. I'll agree. There's a lot of stuff out there that I'm not, like the manifestation thing and all that. But I learned a lot, and I did heal a lot of that issue, and I'm able to actually make money now from my art and my books and coaching and all that kind of thing that several years ago I just would never have even dreamed of it.
Mm.
Yeah.
While you guys were talking through that last question, I was actually on Amazon placing an order for the Lasting Supper Letters for Deconstruction, because I read it when you mentioned it, and I had your author profile up on Amazon, and so I was seeing all the books as you were naming them. And the Lasting Supper Letters for Deconstruction, I love the premise here. David has written a weekly letter to the members. This is a collection of the most helpful correspondences for those going through the process of deconstruction or deconversion, or for those experiencing the painful transition of changing beliefs and losing the faith they once knew. Maybe say a little more about that book. I think this is a book that might be really helpful to listeners of this show and folks who
Mhm.
are in or coming out of a really unhealthy system.
Mhm. So I run an online community called theLastingSupper.com. It's an online community that people pay to be a member of. And you know, even when I say that, I was like, somebody's gonna criticize me for that. So I still have some issues to heal there. But that book is basically a compilation of the best letters I feel are the best letters I wrote to that community on a weekly basis. So I launched that community in 2012, and so over the years I just went back and picked what I thought would be the most helpful letters to people who are deconstructing, and it has everything to do with how to leave the church. What do you say? What do you say to your family? What do you say to your kids? I think I called that chapter "How to Change in Front of Your Kids," and then how to speak about it with your wife, and how to make new friends. Like, how do you make friends? It's a skill we never learned. I mean, when we walked into the church, we were handed friendship on a platter, but now we have to learn how to really make friends. How do you do that? How to avoid conflict when it's not necessary, or how to engage in a conversation if you feel it is helpful, and so on. So it's all those topics, all in that book. And yeah, I think it would help a lot of people who are deconstructing, just sort of get them familiar with the idea that deconstruction, it is not a bad thing. For me, it's actually spiritual progress. It's personal growth. Um, it should be. It shouldn't be demonized as it has been. It shouldn't be chastised as it has been. This is normal, healthy growth. Let's embrace it. For me, deconstruction is a way of life, because I'll always question everything that's being handed to me. And so it's just a posture for living. And that's basically what that book's about.
I want to ask Bill something. How much money would you have paid Bill, or what would you have done to acquire, like, that year when you were still attending church and you're having like physical symptoms, and you're really in the deepest part of your deconstruction, or the hardest part? How much money would you have given for weekly letters that were written for exactly where you are, and your marriage and your children, and all of the questions that David were just talking about? How valuable would that have been?
I was dirt poor, so it would be hard for me to say, but I will say priceless, right? Like, as I'm trying to, when I'm reaching out to my family, and I was a convert, my immediate family are not members of the LDS church, but my in-laws were. And so when I reached out to my in-laws to say, hey, this doesn't add up right, there's things here that don't quite work out the way I was taught, I wasn't trying to bring them down. I wasn't trying to make them crash. I was trying to get validation that I had done the hard work, that I had read the right books, and I had looked in the original sources, and what I found was irreconcilable. But what they heard was this person's turned on them and he's trying to take them down. And having advice about how to handle your family who still believes, how to navigate things with children, it would have been priceless. And so amazing that you've put a project like that together in writing.
Yeah. And it was someone who told me that if spirituality outside of religion is going to have a chance, we can't just have this system where the religions ask for all your time and all your money and all your resources, and then people outside of the religion are just doing it part-time in their spare time for free. That's not going to be helpful for anyone. And so I appreciate that you got over the kind of those money demons and put out resources that were helpful, but also said, this deserves to be paid for. Like, this was work. Like, this was a part of me that was work, and this was time, and this was education, and it deserves to. And so I started to change how I even spent money in the world, because I wanted to put my money towards voices that I wanted to hear more of, because that's actually one of the best things that you can do for spirituality, is give money to the people and the voices that you want to hear more of, and give less money to the voices that you want to hear less of. And so I appreciate just all of that. It's just really beautiful.
All the money I spent on the books, the online courses, the coaches, the therapy, I have no regrets. No, I don't want that money back, because it all helped me. And so it is worth it for sure. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about now. I want to move into the cartoons. So we're going to ask you a few questions about the cartoons, and then Bill, who does all the tech for this show, God bless him, we'll bring up some cartoons and just kind of ask you, the backstory, or how the process that made you kind of create some of our favorite cartoons. But before we get there, how early in your journey, when you were blogging with Naked Pastor, when did art start to appear, and how did you kind of move into cartoons? And then how did you find that this was actually something that was resonating with people?
Mm-hmm. Well, I've always been my dad was a painter and drew a lot. Me growing up watching him, I just sort of learned how to draw and learned how to paint. So what I was actually, while I was a pastor growing up, when I was younger, I was painting and doing some art shows and things like that, selling my paintings and so on. And the early part of Naked Pastor, I would share my paintings, but I think it was around 2006 when I really love a good cartoon, especially a single frame cartoon. My gold standard is the New Yorker. I love New Yorker cartoons, and or like the Far Side, all in one frame. And I just challenged myself one day, try to draw a cartoon, see what happens. And I challenged myself to draw a cartoon every day until I ran out of ideas. And I thought I would last a few weeks, but here I am 18 years later, still drawing cartoons. And I kept doing it because they resonated, and my blog traffic took off, and people were sharing them, and I was getting hate mail, and You know, it just seemed to, I just seemed to find my niche. You know, I seem to be able to find something that I can do. I can draw, and I do have a little bit of a sense of humor, and I can convey in a few words, fewer the better, some ideas. And so I just stuck with it.
Do you remember the first one that you did that day? Do you remember what that one was?
Yeah, the very, very first one was a guy's praying and he's kneeling and he says, "Dear Lord, take away my problems." And actually, this is in 2 frames. Lord, take away all my problems. And then the next frame, all is left is his clothes. He's gone. He was the problem. So that was my very first one. But, you know, and, you know, I'll have to admit, many of my cartoons aren't very good, but there are some good ones. My last book, Flip It Like This, is a collection of my best of cartoons that was published by Broadview and or Broadleaf, and you know, they wanted my best of cartoons, and I've done over 4,000 cartoons, and they wanted about 130. So I had a lot of hard work to do. But you know, those are my best of. There's about 130 there that are made it into the book.
Love it. Should we throw some of these up, Britt?
Yeah, I'd love to.
So let's do this. So there's just our thumbnail, but
Oh yeah.
So the first few here are a handful of ones that were touching to Britt. Yeah.
Yeah. So if there are maybe blind people watching us, there's a group of men. There happen to be 12. And talking to a few women, and they say, "So ladies, thanks for being the first to witness and report the resurrection, and we'll take it from here." So
little patriarchy.
Yeah, little patriarchy there. And people either really love that cartoon or hate that cartoon. So, you know,
I love it so much.
My most offensive cartoons are the ones that challenge the patriarchy and promote feminism or women. They're the most hated, even over my LGBTQ ones.
That's interesting.
Very strong, right?
The Christian systems build on patriarchy. It really is hard to untangle those two, you know?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I've written, you know, papers and talked for a long time about, you know, in Mormonism, you can talk about early Mormon women having more power in the church than they do now, or you talk about Christianity and that it was a woman, you know, the only one who anointed Jesus was a woman, and the ones who saw the resurrection first were women. And there's always like these whispers of femininity, and there's these women, and then you can see that they're just always cut out and over time. And it was just this long and painful, it was painful to kind of go through that journey and kind of see all of that happening and see all of the internalized patriarchy in myself. And it was liberating in some ways and painful in some ways. And then I just feel like you combined that like years long journey into just this one image. Yeah. And it's just like, this one might be my all-time favorite, but I just really love this one.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites too. Thank you.
All right, Britt. What was it about this one?
Yeah, so this one is just because I question the status quo. They brand me a heretic, and he's standing outside the church.
Jesus, yeah.
And then Jesus says, "Welcome to the club." And this one was one of the most confusing things for me to understand. It took me a long time to understand because, like you, David, I was almost shocked that people didn't like to ask questions, or they sometimes didn't want the kind of conversation that I was wanting to have, or when they would read kind of scripture. And either I'm asking questions or I'm challenging something that our community does that Jesus would have called out at the time, because we're clearly doing it. And when that happened, like you, I just was kind of naive, feeling like, oh, everybody else is okay with this too. And then realizing just like the pushback I was getting was almost surprising to me. Like I wasn't expecting it after reading stories about Jesus, because when you read stories about Jesus, he's a heretic and he challenges the institution and he does all kinds of cool things. And then when anyone else does the same and is like Jesus or tries to be like Jesus, then they kick you out just like they did with Jesus. And anyway, again, I have just like a lot of words and a lot of history that you were able to just pack into this one image. So what was kind of the story behind this one?
It's kind of a biblical, if I don't like the word biblical anymore, but it is kind of a theme in the Bible that the people we kind of worship as heroes now, or elevate, let's not say worship, but elevate as heroes in the Bible, were actually rebels. So everybody, Moses, Abraham, Moses, David, Jeremiah, Amos, Isaiah, Jesus, Paul, we could go on and on, John. But, at the time, they were persecuted for it. But it's hindsight that we sort of elevate them to the status of hero when you're in the living presence of somebody who's a rebel or a radical or a critic or whatever. It's like Jesus also is claimed to have said, they stone the prophets, or a prophet isn't welcome in their own hometown. So that's just a theme.
Yeah, there is a big biblical theme of the prophets being the ones who spoke truth to power from the wilderness. Like that is a theme throughout.
Yeah.
And it is so interesting that when you see people do that now, it's almost something that Christianity has flipped, because what I see now is that when Christians play the persecution card and say that, oh, if I'm being attacked or stoned symbolically here, it's because I'm following the prophets. It's interesting that they flipped it, because the reality is that pushback, if you're doing it right, is supposed to come from within the institution itself. And so what I see is Christians, especially the ones that I get on TikTok for whatever reason, who are just kind of walking around telling me that I'm going to hell for various reasons, and just kind of this condescending asshole way of talking. And they'll get pushback for it, and they'll say, well, so persecuted the prophets who came before me, and they'll play that move, when really it was never about the world pushing back at you. If you were doing it right, it was supposed to be you're going to ruffle the feathers of your own institution, which is what happened with the prophets. And so if you're not the kind of Christian who's getting pushback from other Christians, then you're probably doing that wrong. But I think that message gets skewed, and they move that persecution to the world in order to kind of validate how they're treating other people. Anyway.
Yeah.
It seems right along with what you guys are saying, it seems really strange to me. And I've said it before on this podcast, but it seems pertinent now, that Jesus is, when my religious system taught me that Jesus was condemning all of the sinners. And when I went back and read the New Testament with new eyes, what I found was that Jesus was in actuality condemning the religious leaders for their letter of the law instead of being kind and compassionate. And I had this light bulb moment maybe 3 or 4 years ago, where I realized that the very people that Jesus was calling to repentance, the leadership of his religious system, are the very people who ended up putting themselves in charge of Jesus's message and became the gatekeepers of it. And I found that to be really strange. Like, the leaders of the church who deem how I can interact and have a relationship with Christ are actually the very same characters that Christ is condemning in the New Testament, and really the only group of people that he condemns.
Mm-hmm.
I found that to be just really strange.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yep.
Any thoughts there from you?
Well, I agree. My concern, and this is another level of having to peel back I need to change rooms. I have another meeting here coming up. How long does this go on? I'm sorry to.
You tell me when you need to be done.
Yeah, in a second here. Just one sec. Are we still live?
We are, but you tell me what time you need to be finished by, and Britt and I will wrap up by then.
Okay.
Do you have another
coming here at 5 for another meeting?
What time's that start?
Oh, that's 2 your time.
Gotcha. So 4 minutes. So we'll wrap up quick. Britt, do you mind if I share maybe one more?
I'm sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Let me find. So one of the things you seem to be pertinent about often in
Mhm.
regards to the work that you do is this idea that questions should have been allowed the whole time. And a lot of your, I say comics or cartoons, they seem to point at the idea that questions in the church are seen as very bad. And Britt and I experienced this to the nth degree, that in Mormonism, questions are almost seen as a pariah that
Mhm.
will just
Mhm.
take everyone down a slippery slope to unbelief. And maybe it would, but questions seem to be of real value that religious churches don't really seem to want to place value on.
Mhm.
Any thoughts there from you? And then I guess we'll wrap up at that point.
Yeah, like for me, I feel the church has dropped the ball. I think the church is great for carrying us along to adolescence, but once we become adolescent and we start thinking for ourselves, we start questioning authority, which is natural. We start questioning, why do I need to believe this? Why should I obey my teacher? Why should I follow the law? You know, all this kind of thing is just natural. That's when the church drops the ball, because it doesn't like that kind of uh, disruption of order, and it wants to be able to continue managing us into adulthood, when in fact it delays it or even prevents it.
Yeah.
So that's my whole idea about questions. Is it's a natural process. It's something we all should be embracing, and it's a part of personal growth. And you know, I think the greatest wisdom teachers, including Jesus, the Buddha, Socrates, etc., questions were one of the most profound tools to use to awaken wisdom in ourselves and in others.
Love it.
I think that's a beautiful place to wrap up. We don't want to take any more of your time. We just so appreciate you letting us get to know the man behind the cartoons, and just found so much wisdom in just the past hour we've had with you. And Bill does a great job making sure that there's links to all the things that we talked about, so people know how to continue to support your work in the world, because I know my life is richer having your voice in the world, and we just thank you for all that you do.
Yeah, you help a lot of us not feel alone. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Have me back.
Okay,
We will.
do.
We'll have you back, David.
Take it easy, David. Bye, everybody.
Sorry for the abrupt end.
No problem. In fact, I'll let you go, and then Britt and I will talk off the air, and you can get to your meeting, my friend.
All right.
Awesome. That was great. He really is one of these human beings who's doing something in the world that is much needed. There's so many folks who have that dark night of the soul.
Mm-hmm.
And to have a chance to, just through a little comic, to get a little bit of a breath of, because I think most of us in this deconstructing Mormon scene have seen his work.
Mm-hmm.
And just, a simple glance, read a sentence, and you sort of sense that you're not alone in this whole thing.
Yeah, and I just really value too, like, the grace. You can tell that he's done deep inner work just by the kind of the wisdom and compassion that he's able to hold, because sometimes in these post-religious spaces, and I understand that anger is like a healthy phase to go through, and sometimes you just need to unleash fire, and that's just the healthiest thing for you to do. But sometimes, it can get into a shaming place, or it can get into a superiority place, and these other kind of not healthy places. And so his ability to just say, hey, religion's going to be around. And if it's going to be around, I've thought a lot about this. I've been in this world for a long time. I'm going to throw my voice into the ring to try to make it better for the people who are in it, for the people who are in mixed faith marriages, for the people who are coming out of it, for the people who are trying to find community as they're coming out of it. And I just find a lot of beauty and wisdom in that approach, rather than like, oh, I was a pastor and I wasted my whole life, and now life is meaningless and religion's stupid and it took everything from me. I just find a lot more just wisdom in his approach that allows compassion for his previous self, but also allows his voice to kind of say, I have something to say about this. And I love it.
I want to throw a couple more of these up.
Let's do.
So here, God revealed to me that there are two people in this church who are not conforming to our values. And for folks listening in audio, there's a preacher at a pulpit. It's obvious he's wearing a mask. The entire congregation has masks on, and every mask is a smiley face, except for two. One has a question mark, so he's got questions. And the one person in the fourth row has got a frowny face. but even they're wearing masks, right? Like we're all
Yeah.
wearing masks in church. And the person who can't make the history or the theology or the doctrine work is not conforming to the values. The person who's having a traumatic experience and not enjoying it is part of the problem, right? And nowhere is the idea that maybe because we're all wearing masks and not being honest with ourselves, maybe that's the issue.
Yeah. Isn't that so crazy how he can pack? I've never seen that particular cartoon before, but you and I can talk for a long time. In fact, we have before about how you have to kind of mask in these church spaces in order to belong. And he can just pull that off with just this brief image. Yeah. Everything that we've said about how you have to put on a mask in order to belong and what that costs. And
not everybody there's happy, right? Like they're all wearing
Yeah.
a mask that says they're happy, but
Yes.
behind that mask is a person who's hiding their real self.
Yeah. This is why, I mean, I get sometimes on TikTok, I'll get people who say that people who are religious have better mental health, and they say that they're happier. And I always wonder, especially when I think back to my time in Mormonism, that if I were asked if I was happy, the pressure that I would feel to say yes, right? And then we know the reality of the state of Utah and the use of Prozac, and those statistics do not line up well. And so I always wonder, like, you know, who's speaking honestly, and there's a lot of complexity in saying that religious people are happier. Sometimes it's just because they have better community resources, better social safety net, and then sometimes is it because you're wearing a mask and you think that you have to be happy because you are in the right religion, right? You won the lottery. You are God's special favorite people. Why aren't you happy in this pressure to wear that mask? But man, he just does all that in one sentence. It's really quite incredible what he's able to do.
This sort of captures that other side of it, which is there's a person kneeling by a bed praying, and they're saying, "Dear God, like what the fuck, you know? Like what the fuck? Like,
yeah.
Some shit happened today that, you know, if you're really
it's
there,
not
it
okay.
doesn't really explain it. No.
Yeah, it's not okay. How is this okay?"
There are so many. We lived in a faith where people would get up once a month and talk about the moment God helped them with these tender mercies of helping them find their keys or whatever the silly story was. And meanwhile, you sort of blocked out all of the atrocious things that are happening in the world. And somehow God cares about, you know, Sister Jones up in Kaysville who can't find her keys, but he somehow neglects these, you know, 40 kids this week, which were sold into the sex trade business. And it's, you know, kind of that the problem of evil, essentially, right? The philosophical problem of evil. But dear God, like what the fuck?
Like really? All right. Do you have any more? Yeah, these
are
good.
I have like 50 of them. We won't do all of them. Let me.
I love these. Go back to the couples ones. The couples ones.
By the way, look at Buddhism for Beginners. That might be Jack Kornfield's book.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, I do. He does some great couples ones that I know that he really does a lot of work to speak to mixed faith marriages, because as he's found, like we've found too, people don't deconstruct usually at the same time in the same way. In fact, I've almost never heard of a couple that like, wow, we were listening to the same podcast and we both had the same response at the same time. Like that's just really unheard of. And so the work that he does with mixed faith marriages and putting words to kind of that feeling of someone is changing and it's really rattling the relationship are ones that deeply hit me, because it was, you know, I was in a mixed faith marriage for a couple of years before Chad eventually left with me. But yeah, I really love his couple one. So this one says, these people love each other. That means that they trust one another with their own spiritual journeys. Oof. And like how many times, you know, for mixed faith marriages, would it improve if people just trusted each other with their own spiritual journey and were curious about it and open to the spiritual journey of the other person, instead of you're changing in a way that threatens my identity and now there's an issue with my marriage. So again, he says so much with so little.
This one shows it shows a couple, the one we're just now talking about, shows a couple on a bed. Looks like a husband and a wife. One's reading the Bible, the other one's reading Buddhism for Beginners, which has got to be Noah Rasheta or Jack Kornfield, I think.
Yeah.
And that whole line about both of them trust each other. I think, as you point out, mixed faith marriages are tough enough as they are, and Let's just show two more. This one is a bunch of exclamation points beating the shit out of a question mark.
Yeah.
So the idea that certainty is the only acceptable thing here.
Yeah. Isn't it? I mean, just so much. It's just four exclamation marks hitting a question mark. But yet the feeling, like I remember the feeling of people declaring their testimony louder with me as if that would solve my question. And it just, you just
yeah. And if you got up and said anything nuanced, somebody would get up immediately after you to say, the Holy Ghost glove, the 5 things you could know. And it seems like an effort to sort of silence you.
Yeah.
All right. Let's do one more.
Yeah.
Here's the bishop behind the desk. It says pastor, but we'll say it's an LDS bishop. I've never experienced spiritual abuse. And she said, not as a victim anyway. So yeah, you've just been on the other side of the desk,
Yeah. He just really nails these dynamics of the mixed faith marriage or the questioner in the congregation, or he has multiple where there's like a woman with the pastor and the woman is the one deconstructing and kind of that relationship dynamic. And you can tell that he's spent time in this space and really thought about it because he can just really nail that relationship dynamic in a way that says, oh my God, that's me too. That's how I feel in church too. That's how I felt when I talked to my religious leader too.
Look at this one. Jesus says, come unto me and I will give you rest. And there's a bunch of people in between him and a church. And the church says, come unto me and I will give you religious trauma. Yeah, he does. He captures a lot in such a little bit. And I'm really glad that you reached out and got him on the podcast. He's seems like such a sincere, caring man who's spent his entire life pushing against the status quo and trying to get the church to see that it's part of it's maybe a major part of the problem, if not the most significant part of the problem when it comes to religion.
Yeah. And yeah, just last thing from me. Yeah, I really loved him. I can tell he's really walked the walk and done some inner work and is holding space for all of this. And I also think he's one of those guys that, like, yes, he's an ex-pastor, but I think he still values the mystic Jesus. I think you can tell that in some of his cartoons, where Jesus is the heretic, is the mystic. And I can still see that there's still something about Jesus for him as a mystic that speaks to him, even though he also sees that in Buddha and other characters that he's mentioned. And so I also really love that too, valuing what, the wisdom has to value while kind of giving voice to the abuses, which is what you and I try to do on this podcast too. So I am going to go buy one of his prints just to show my appreciation for him and his voice and work in the world. Bill did a great job posting links to all the books and his website where you can do the same if you have seen some of his cartoons or kind of want to support him. And as always, for more podcasts like this, where we get to hear the deconstruction of people who are really in this space, who were in this space even before you and I were in this space, Bill. Just keep supporting the podcast so that we can continue to have these conversations.
Awesome. Britt, thanks for putting this one together. Folks, you can check us out at almostawakened.org. We're also available. Podcast audio is on any third-party podcast app, such as Apple or Google Play, Stitcher, and others. And the video version of the podcast is on YouTube, on the Mormon Discussion Incorporated channel. It has its own playlist, Almost Awakened. Check us out there. And we really appreciate everybody who is a follower, listener of our program. And thanks to all those who support this work so that we can keep doing it.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, everybody.
The next 2 weeks, just so everybody knows, we're going to do 2 weeks on cults. We're going to watch the Netflix, I don't remember what show it was on, the documentary about how to create a cult. And there's kind of 6 chapters to that of how you would build a cult. So Bill and I are going to go watch that and take notes and talk about cults. And then after that, I found an author of someone who is an expert in cults to come onto the podcast and talk to us more. So Bill and I are going to, we're going to do some research on cults and kind of get the conversation going. And then we'll bring in kind of an expert on cults and how to create a cult and how cults work. That's just really, really interesting. And so we'll be doing cults the next 2 weeks, which everybody should be familiar with because they're just everywhere and we are just wired for them. And I find it so fascinating to dive into that world. So we'll be doing cults cults the next 2 weeks.
That's exciting. I felt a little triggered as you were saying that, but I'm going to go make myself a pitcher of Kool-Aid and watch the program and take some notes.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're going to learn how to turn this podcast into a cult.
Let's do it.
We'll get a step-by-step guide.
Yeah, we'll come back. I'm afraid there's going to be a lot of similarities between that program and the programming I received. So
yeah, I know, and that's gonna hurt. But we gotta go. We gotta go into it.
Let's do it.
And so it'll be good. All right, thanks everybody.
Have a great day, everyone.
This has been another Almost Awakened episode. Check us out at almostawakened.org, where you can check out past episodes, make a donation to keep this podcast running, email us a question or comment, or find out more about the resources shared in today's episode. For coaching opportunities or extra support, visit nononsensespirituality.com to meet with Certified Spiritual Director Brittany Hartley.